Okay, so if you thought the first two videos in this series were insane and confusing and convoluted, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. We'll talk about that, and we're going to start right now. Hello, my name is Kyle, and this is The Conservative Take, where we take culture, TV, movie news, and politics and filter to you the right way. If this is your first time here, then please consider hitting that like and subscribe button and that bell icon so you don't miss any future content. Also, if you'd like to join this channel and support us, then please click that join button to find out how to do just that. Now, this series, as you know by now already, is not a predictive series. It's just a series to inform you, to let you know what are the possibilities, who has the power, what does the Constitution say, what's happened in the past, and this video is going to have all that in spades, and we're going to dig in that right here. So in this video, I'm going to try and take it slowly, but we're going to go back to Alexander McCree, the same gentleman, the same Harvard lawyer, who we referenced heavily in part 2 of this series. If you didn't see that, you should probably check it out because this guy is pretty brilliant. And so he has this article here called "If Chaos is a Ladder, America's Election Laws Are an Elevator." He says Americans don't play by the rules as written, and the rules as written don't make it any sense. Very important to go through this because he lays it out in a way that kind of gives just about every possible scenario of what could possibly happen, which is what this video series is all about. So with that being said, let's just break it down real quickly. Let's go back to December 14th. That was an important date. And I'm going to summarize what's here behind me right now. So on December 14th, if you remember, every state in the United States met at the state capitals to do a couple things. Overall, they were trying to take their popular vote and make a decision of who they're going to cast their electoral representatives for the Electoral College to decide the president and vice president. So what they did was in each state, they did two things. They counted the votes, and then they did something called the Articles of Certification, which was basically 6 documents they put together, and that went along with the a document called assertion that was also done in corresponding with the governor of their state, and that all went together. It was signed, it was sealed, registered mail, and sent off to the Senate, the president of the Senate, which is Vice President Mike Pence, and there it sits sealed until January 6th, where they're opened one by one and then counted. And then again, if you don't know what happens after that, check out the first 2 videos in the series and we go through all of that. So if that's clear, that's where we are right now. We have all of these votes that are signed, supposedly sealed, and delivered to Washington, waiting for them to be counted on January 6th. The question is, what happens if the rules weren't followed? What if the electors weren't properly appointed, don't meet on the right day, don't have a certificate from the governor, and forget to sign their names? What happens? He lays out here at least 10 cases where in the past rules weren't followed. He says here, in the past 250 years, there have been an incredible amount of irregularities in how the electors were appointed and how they cast their ballot. Specific accounts include the Georgia incident of 1800, where electors from Georgia failed to send the certificate of the vote and instead just signed their names to the back of the governor's certificate ascertainment without stating exactly how they cast their vote. You had Massachusetts of 1809. You had the Indian incident of 1817, where the Indiana electors were elected before Indiana joined the Union. You had the Missouri incident of 1821, the Postmaster incident of 1837, the Michigan incident of 1837. You had, by the way, 1837 had a lot of problems. Yeah, the Wisconsin incident of 1857, where the entire House and Senate disputed the electoral votes of Wisconsin because the electors didn't cast their votes on the proper day. You have the Mississippi incident of 1873, where the Mississippi electors did not certify that they voted by ballot, and one of the electors didn't have his appointment signed by the governor of Mississippi as required by state law. Or Georgia incident of 1873, where one of the Georgia electors failed to follow the constitutional requirement that he vote for at least one person who wasn't a resident of his own state. And lastly, he mentions here the Texas incident of 1873. What's up with 1873? Where the executive authority of Texas had failed to certify its electors. Well, you get the point, all right? You get the idea. So he says here, do you spot a pattern in each of these 10 cases listed? The presidential electors cast ballots that broke the rules. In every case, the votes were counted. In America, presidential elections get their votes counted even when they don't even send a certificate of the vote, represented territories that weren't even states, weren't certified as properly appointed by the state governor, didn't cast their votes on their prescribed day, didn't certify that they voted by ballot, were officers of the federal government, which, by the way, is not legal, right? They even had replacements in 1 year where electors were arbitrarily appointed by the remaining electors without even a majority vote. And lastly, even voted for people who weren't even residents of the state. And so now let's set the stage. It's January 6th. We're in the House chamber. We have the president of the Senate, Mike Pence, presiding. You have these envelopes in front of him. He's about to count those envelopes to decide which ones he's going to count, which ones he's not. Vice President Mike Pence is presiding, and as the 12th Amendment says,
the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted.
But here's where it gets fun. It says all the certificates. But what about the states where there's two? Let's take Georgia, for example, in this case here. What happens if there are two certificates from Georgia? What happens? At that point, you can guess the Democrats will clamor saying that those were invalid because they didn't meet any of the regulations we mentioned before. The governor didn't sign it, or it was invalid in the date it was put together, or any number of irregularities, which, by the way, we mentioned before, at least 10 times it didn't matter. They were counted anyway. So what happens? And as McCree says, no one knows. No one knows what happened at this point, but he goes through several scenarios of what could happen. Let's check these out right here. So going back to the second part of this series, we talked about the President of the Senate, Vice President Pence, ability to go and count the votes of his choosing based on non-electors and electors, and based on the validity of those and the powers invested there based on historical precedent and constitutional law. That's there. And so I won't hash that, but that's the first scenario. Second scenario is this. So this second scenario is dealing with the Electoral Count Act of 1887. It's one of the worst pieces of legislation ever written. It came out of the election of 1876, where there's a highly contested election where Rutherford B. Hayes was elected through compromises and scandals. And so, but again, this Electoral Act of 1887 is very convoluted, makes no sense, has a paragraph of 109 words, which mean nothing to anybody, but it does lay out some idea of what could happen. And so we're going to go through that right here. So let's dig into what the 1887 Electoral Vote Act says. Here McCree says, the law states that the President of the Senate shall be their presiding officer. 2 tellers shall be previously appointed on the part of the Senate and 2 on the part of the House of Representatives, to whom shall be handed, and they are opened by the President of the Senate, all the certificates and papers purporting to the certificates of the electoral votes, which certificates and papers shall be opened, presented, and acted upon in alphabetical order of the states. I'm going to summarize this, and I could be wrong, but what Alexander McCree is saying here, and I tend to agree with him on this, which, what do I know? But the key phrase here is all the certificates and papers purporting to be certificates of the electoral votes, which certificates and papers shall be opened, presented, and acted upon in alphabetical order of the states. Purported to be certificates, which means valid certificates, valid electoral votes. And what McCree is arguing here, and what many other legal scholars are arguing, is that what if Pence doesn't open them because he deems them as fraudulent, that they're not purported to be certificates? Then what happens? What if he just takes the Democrat certificate and dumps it in the trash can and only counts the Republicans' ones? And that's the situation we're dealing with. And from here, there are 3 possible scenarios. All right, now, so scenario number 1 is Vice President Pence opens only the ballots that he thinks are the valid ones that are purported to be certificates, meaning the Republican ones, and just takes Democrat ones and dumps them into the trash can. Okay. And by the way, here's an article below. I'm going to leave a link below of the fact that Mike Pence, if he goes ahead and certifies fraudulent electors, he's actually breaking the law. I'll leave a link to the article below. Check it out for yourself. I mentioned that in the last video, but that's what I was talking about. So going back to what I said before, Pence decides to open only the ones that are valid, that are purported to be certificates, takes the Democrat ones, puts them to the trash. And of course, the Democrats at that point are in outrage and they force him to back down. He acquiesces and he decides, okay, fine, I'm gonna go ahead and open both of them, both the Biden and the Trump certificates. Now what happens? In this case, one of three things can happen. The first case is the thing we call safe harbor. It's the 6 days prior to the 14th where they had the ability or a chance to raise grievances or inconsistencies in the ballot so that they could have those cleared up. And if it passes that date, then they're considered safe and will be counted. Well, that's what the first scenario is, that Democrats will say, we're only going to go with the ones that have safe harbor. The second scenario is if both electors from that state are considered to be safe harbor, then none of those get counted. The third scenario is what we call a governor's tiebreaker, where simply, it's long and convoluted, but simply they will take the governor certified electors, not the ones that came from the Republicans from the House, you know, like in Michigan, where they're out in the parking lot voting because they couldn't get inside because the governor banned them. So they would take the governor's ones and not the state legislators from the Republicans in this case. So you can imagine a scenario that the Democrats are really upset because neither are being counted, or both could be counted because they're both safe harbor. They could evoke what they call the governor's tiebreaker, which you could possibly absolutely see happening. That's going to be their failsafe. That's why they wanted so many governors to certify these things so quickly so they could fall back on that governor's tiebreaker. If that's the case, and I know how you feel about this next statement because I know how I feel about this person, but Mitch McConnell could really get angry, or the Republicans could really get angry and push that the Electoral Act of 1887 is not constitutional and therefore inapplicable. Then what do you do? In our last video, we talked about Vasan Kasavan and his article about, is the Electoral Act constitutional? He spent 124 pages talking about this. I put it in the link prior to this. I'll put a link below as well. And he talks about
the structural argument reveals that the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional. As a prima facie matter, the Electoral Count Act, to the extent that it is a law that has legal force, clearly violates the anti-binding principle of rulemaking. This is perhaps the strongest structural argument against the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Act.
Then, if that's the case, and the Electoral Act of 1887 is not constitutional, then what happens? So, as it gets crazier, if the House and the Senate can't agree, and there's total chaos going back and forth, total debate, and no one can agree to even have a vote then what happens here, Kasaval says that it will go to the 20th Amendment, which goes to the presidential succession.
Congress may by law provide for the case wherein neither a president-elect nor a vice president-elect shall have qualified, declaring who shall then act as president, or the manner in which one who is to act shall be selected, and such person shall act accordingly until a president or vice president shall have qualified.
Well, in 1947, Congress did invoke a law called the Presidential Line of Succession Act. And here it talks about who becomes president if the president is not available. What happens after that? And here is your line of succession. So if Congress can't settle on Trump or Biden, it goes to Pence. But if the election is disputed long enough to matter, Vice President Pence's term will have expired along with Trump's term, then the president would be Nancy Pelosi. As horrible as that seems, right? We at least have a president, right? I mean, we don't have a constitutional crisis, right? Well, not so fast, because unfortunately, the 1947 Succession Act could also be unconstitutional. According to the September 2003 joint hearing, I'll leave it here as well. It's a lot of words, but there's a case to be made that even that's not constitutional. And so if that happens and the presidential line of succession is unconstitutional, what does that actually mean? So do we just skip the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate and proceed directly to the Secretary of State? Does the Supreme Court decide? Does the Supreme Court send it back to Congress? What if Congress can't agree? We could easily end up in a situation where Nancy Pelosi and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo both claim to be president. Okay, so let's run down the possible scenarios and who would win in each of these scenarios. Let's take a look at this. Biden would win if Vice President Pence opens all the certificates. There's only one per state, and they are treated as within the safe harbors without objection. We already know that they're dueling electors there as well, so that's still up in the air in terms of that. Trump would win if there are multiple certificates per state and Vice President Pence unilaterally exercises his count and open authority to give preference to Republican certificates. 3. Biden would win if there are multiple certificates per state. Vice President Pence opens all the certificates and the governor's tiebreaker applies because some are certified. 4. Trump would win if there are multiple certificates per state. Vice President Pence opens all the certificates, the governor's tiebreaker doesn't apply, and the dispute ends up getting voted on by Congress by state. 5. Pelosi, if the Vice President, House, and Senate end up in dispute from the above and doesn't get settled by January 20th. 6. Pompeo, if the Vice President, House, and Senate end up in dispute from the above and doesn't get settled by January 20th, and their Presidential Succession Act is deemed unconstitutional. Or 7, who knows? No one knows, again, what could happen now. Number 1 would be the most likely scenario since it's happened about 75% of the time. But as I told someone else before, we've had very decisive elections in the 20th century. We've had Reagan twice, we had Obama twice, we had Clinton twice. The only real close elections were Nixon and Kennedy and Gore and Bush. The others were pretty much well decided. So we're in uncharted territory. And even the one in 1960 with Nixon and Kennedy, even that had dueling electors as well. And of course, we know about 2000. So in the end, we're all going to take this elevator ride to chaos because no one knows what's going to happen. Anyone who does know, they're absolutely lying to you. Now, I will say this. As of the day of recording on this video, he says here that the President Pelosi is trending on Twitter suggesting that the digital intelligentsia is suddenly waking up to the chaos I projected here several weeks ago. President Pelosi is scenario number 5 in my 7 scenarios. No one except me seems to have figured out that if Trump is willing to escalate to the point where Pelosi could be sworn in, he will certainly be willing to escalate to a claim that the Presidential Succession Act is unconstitutional and bring us to scenario number 6, which would be Mike Pompeo. And so with that, I'm pretty sure you're just as confused as I was before I start this. In fact, in some ways, I'm more confused and uncertain of the outcome of any of this. But let me know what you think in the comments below. What you think is going to happen, how it's going to play out. Which of the 7 scenarios do you think is going to happen? Or none of them, or maybe another one. There are other scenarios out there as well that I'm not going to talk about here because YouTube has a strict restriction on what we can talk about when it comes to this election, unfortunately. But if you like what we do in this channel, we take culture, movie news, and politics and filter it to you the right way, then please click the like and subscribe button and bell icon so you don't miss any future content. If you would like to support this channel in more ways than that, you can click on that join button below to find out how to do just that. Also, check out our Discord server. There's a lot of cool things there as well. As always, please check out some content that we have right